He pushed his cleaning cart through the executive floor at 6 a.m., emptying trash bins and wiping down conference tables while senior executives ignored his existence. They walked past him, discussing million-dollar deals without lowering their voices because they didn't consider him capable of understanding. They left sensitive documents on desks because a janitor couldn't possibly matter. They mocked his silence, his age, his invisibility. For 23 years, he'd cleaned their offices, maintained their spaces, and observed their character. And for 23 years, they'd never once asked his name or wondered why someone in his 70s was still pushing a mop. That morning, after a minor incident that wasn't his fault, the board decided to make an example of him during a restructuring period. They fired him in front of managers and staff, coldly efficient, congratulating themselves for cutting dead weight and proving they were serious about discipline. He didn't argue or beg. He simply nodded, handed over his badge, and left carrying a small box of personal belongings. Hours later, during an emergency board meeting to meet the company's new majority owner, the boardroom doors opened, and he walked back in. Not in a janitor's uniform, but in a $15,000 suit. Beside him stood the investor they had been told was acquiring the company. The room froze, because the janitor they'd just fired wasn't a janitor at all. He was the founder who'd stepped away decades ago while secretly retaining a 51% controlling stake, and they'd just failed the final test. Monday, October 30th, 2023, 5:47 a.m. The headquarters of Meridian Technologies occupied 43 floors of a glass tower in downtown Seattle, home to 2,800 employees and a company valued at $4.2 billion. The building was quiet at this hour, just security guards, a few workaholics who'd pulled all-nighters, and the cleaning staff who maintained the corporate facade before the workday began. On the 42nd floor, the executive level, 73-year-old Thomas Harper pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, his movements practiced and efficient. He wore the gray uniform of Apex Janitorial Services, the company contracted to clean Meridian's offices, with his name badge pinned to his chest, Thomas, Custodial. Thomas was short and slightly hunched, with white hair thinning at the crown, weathered hands that showed decades of manual labor, and the kind of face that people looked past rather than at. He moved quietly, almost invisibly, the way custodial staff learn to move in corporate environments where acknowledging their presence might be uncomfortable. He entered the executive conference room, the crown room they called it, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, its $80,000 conference table, its leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Thomas emptied the trash bins, wiped down the table, straightened the chairs, and cleaned the windows until they were spotless. As he worked, he noticed documents left on the table from last night's late meeting. He gathered them carefully, 3 copies of a restructuring proposal, coffee-stained and marked with handwritten notes. The proposals outlined plans to eliminate 400 positions across the company, mostly in manufacturing and customer service, to optimize operational efficiency and improve margins. Thomas placed the documents in a neat stack at the head of the table, where CEO Richard Blackstone would sit during today's board meeting. He'd learned over 23 years of cleaning this office that executives were careless with sensitive information because they never imagined the janitor could read, understand, or care about their business decisions. He moved to the next office, Richard Blackstone's corner suite. The door was locked, but Thomas had master keys. He entered quietly, emptied the trash, vacuumed the carpet, dusted the shelves lined with awards and photos of Richard with various politicians and celebrities. On Richard's desk sat a framed photo of his family at their vacation home in Aspen. Beside it sat Thomas's employee evaluation from last month, submitted by the facilities manager, but likely never read by anyone executive level. The evaluation was adequate. Satisfactory performance, no issues. The kind of perfunctory assessment given to someone whose work was invisible. Thomas had been cleaning Meridian's offices since 2000, shortly after the company had gone public. He'd watched it grow from a startup occupying 3 floors to a corporation spanning an entire tower. He'd seen executives come and go, witnessed countless meetings through the glass walls they thought were private, observed how people treated staff when they believed no one important was watching. And for 23 years, no executive had ever learned his last name. At 6:30 a.m., other cleaners arrived for the morning shift. Maria Santos, 56, who cleaned the finance department, greeted Thomas in Spanish. Buenos días, Thomas. ¿Cómo estás? Bien, gracias, Maria. ¿Y tú? They spoke in a mixture of English and Spanish, the private language of custodial staff who existed in the margins of corporate America. Maria had been cleaning here for 15 years. Her daughter was in medical school. Her son worked in IT. Both had succeeded because Maria worked 2 jobs to pay for their education. Did you hear about the restructuring? Maria asked, switching to English. They're cutting 400 jobs. My nephew works in customer service. He's worried. I heard, Thomas said quietly. They left the proposals out last night. Always leaving things out, like we can't read, Maria said bitterly. Like we're furniture. Thomas said nothing, but he understood. Invisibility was the defining characteristic of custodial work. You were expected to maintain spaces without disrupting them, to exist without being acknowledged, to observe without being seen. By 7:30 a.m., the executive floor was coming alive. Assistants arrived to prepare for the day, brewing coffee in the executive break room, arranging documents for meetings, setting up presentations. Managers began filtering in, heading to their offices, barely registering Thomas's presence as he finished his morning rounds. At 8 a.m., Thomas clocked out in the basement facilities office, hung up his keys, and prepared to leave for the day. His shift was 5:30 a.m. to 8 a.m., 5 days a week, 50 weeks a year for 23 years. The pay was $80 an hour, $37,540 annually before taxes. Enough to live on if you were careful, not enough to thrive. But Thomas had never complained about the wages because money wasn't why he was here. As he was leaving, his supervisor Robert Chen stopped him. Thomas, facilities manager wants to see you before you go. Something about a coffee spill in the crown room yesterday? Thomas's expression didn't change. I'll go see him. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor where facilities management had their offices. The manager, Donald Pierce, was a officious man in his 40s who treated custodial staff like incompetent children and executives like gods. Harper, Donald said, not looking up from his computer. We got a complaint about the crown room. Apparently there was a coffee stain on the carpet yesterday afternoon that wasn't cleaned up. CEO's assistant slipped and nearly fell. This is unacceptable. I clean that room every morning at 6 a.m., Thomas said calmly. If there was a spill yesterday afternoon, I wouldn't have known about it. My shift ends at 8 a.m. That's not my problem. You're responsible for that room. You should have checked it. I'm not scheduled to work afternoons. Then maybe you should be more proactive, Donald snapped. Consider this a written warning. One more incident and you're done. Understand? Thomas understood several things in that moment. He understood that Donald was looking for an excuse to fire someone to demonstrate accountability during the restructuring. He understood that custodial staff were convenient scapegoats. And he understood that this wasn't about a coffee stain. It was about power and who had it. I understand, Thomas said quietly. Good. Get out of here. Thomas left the facilities office and headed home, a modest apartment in North Seattle, a 15-minute bus ride from the office. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, sparsely furnished. Most of his belongings were books, business management texts, leadership studies, organizational psychology, financial analysis. The library of someone who'd spent decades studying how companies succeed and fail. He made coffee, sat at his small kitchen table, and reviewed documents he'd photographed over the past 6 months using a small camera disguised as a pen, a tool he'd purchased specifically for this purpose. The documents told a story of systemic problems at Meridian Technologies, falsified safety reports to avoid regulatory fines, discriminatory hiring practices in the manufacturing division, retaliation against employees who raised concerns, financial projections inflated to mislead investors, executive bonuses paid, while frontline staff faced layoffs. Thomas compiled these documents into a comprehensive report, organizing them by category, cross-referencing incidents, building a case that would be devastating if presented to the right audience. He'd been building this case for 3 years, ever since it had become clear that Meridian's leadership had drifted far from the principles on which the company had been founded. Thomas Harper wasn't just a janitor, he was Thomas Harper, the founder of Meridian Technologies, who'd started the company 42 years ago in a garage with $50,000 borrowed from family and a revolutionary idea about data compression algorithms. He'd built it into a success, had taken it public in 1995, and had stepped down as CEO in 2001 at age 51 to pursue what he'd told the board was early retirement and personal interests. What he'd actually pursued was an experiment. When Thomas had left leadership, he'd sold 49% of his shares publicly, but retained 51% through a trust structure that was deliberately obscured through layers of holding companies and nominee shareholders. As far as anyone at Meridian knew, Thomas Harper, the founder, had fully divested and disappeared. The trust's ownership was registered under the name Cascade Holdings, with no public connection to Thomas. For 22 years, Thomas had lived quietly, investing his wealth carefully, maintaining a low profile. Then 2 years ago, he'd done something unusual. He'd applied for a custodial position at his own company under his real name, using a resume that showed only janitorial experience. No connection to the tech industry, no hint of his education or business background. He'd been hired without anyone recognizing him, partly because he'd aged, partly because no one looks closely at janitors, partly because the idea that a billionaire founder would apply to clean offices was absurd. And for 23 months, Thomas had pushed a mop through the halls of Meridian Technologies, observing how the company he'd built was being run, watching how leaders treated people when they thought no one important was watching, testing whether the culture he'd tried to create had survived his absence. It hadn't. The company was profitable and growing, but it had become cruel. Leaders prioritized appearance over substance. They treated frontline staff as disposable. They rewarded loyalty to executives over integrity. They made decisions that maximized short-term stock prices while damaging long-term sustainability. And Thomas had documented all of it from the invisible position of a janitor who everyone assumed was too old, too uneducated, too irrelevant to matter. Now, sitting in his small apartment reviewing evidence of systematic failure, Thomas made a decision. The experiment was over. It was time to return. Tuesday, October 31st, 2023, 7:45 a.m. Thomas arrived for his morning shift to find a message from Robert Chen, his supervisor. Report to HR immediately. Do not begin cleaning. Thomas's expression didn't change. He took the elevator to the 5th floor, where Human Resources had their offices. The receptionist, a young woman named Ashley who'd never acknowledged his existence in 2 years, looked at him with barely concealed disdain. "You're Harper? Custodial?" "Yes." "Conference room B, they're waiting." Thomas walked to conference room B and entered to find 3 people: Donald Pierce from Facilities, Jennifer Martinez from Human Resources, and unexpectedly, Marcus Webb, Meridian's chief operating officer. Marcus was 48, ambitious, and known for his ruthless approach to operational efficiency. He'd been with Meridian for 8 years, had risen quickly, and was widely considered Richard Blackstone's likely successor as CEO. "Mr. Harper, sit down," Jennifer said, her tone professional but cold. Thomas sat. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," Jennifer continued, reading from a prepared statement. "Yesterday afternoon, a significant safety incident occurred in the executive conference room. CEO Richard Blackstone's assistant, Ms. Patterson, slipped on a coffee stain that had not been cleaned, resulting in a near injury. This represents a serious failure in your custodial responsibilities." "I cleaned that room at 6 a.m., Thomas said calmly. "The spill occurred at 3 p.m., 9 hours after my shift ended. Your responsibility includes ensuring cleanliness throughout the day," Donald Pierce interjected. "You should have been monitoring." "I'm not scheduled to work afternoons. I'm not paid to monitor spaces outside my shift." That's exactly the attitude that's being terminated. Marcus Webb spoke for the first time, his voice sharp. Meridian Technologies requires employees who take initiative, who go above and beyond, who understand that excellence means more than checking boxes. Frankly, Mr. Harper, you've been coasting for years. You do the minimum. You're disengaged. You're exactly the kind of dead weight we need to eliminate. Thomas looked at Marcus steadily. "I've cleaned this building for 23 years without a single substantiated complaint. This incident occurred outside my shift and wasn't my responsibility." "And that's the problem," Marcus said. "You think in terms of responsibility and shifts instead of ownership and excellence. We're restructuring to build a culture of accountability, and that starts with removing people who don't meet our standards. Thomas understood what was really happening. Marcus had been advocating for aggressive cost-cutting. Firing a long-term custodial employee publicly would send a message to all staff. No one is safe. Everyone must perform. Loyalty means nothing compared to current standards. He was being made an example. Additionally, Jennifer continued, we've received reports of you taking photographs on company property. That's a violation of our confidentiality policies. This was new information and concerning. Someone had noticed his documentation efforts. I've taken no photographs, Thomas said calmly. This was technically true. He'd used a camera pen, not his phone. Security footage shows you with your phone in the executive conference room on multiple occasions, Donald said. Looking at my phone isn't taking photographs. Regardless, Jennifer said, the combination of the safety incident, reports of policy violations, and your unwillingness to take responsibility means we have no choice but to terminate. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay despite not being entitled to it under your contract. You need to surrender your badge and keys immediately and leave the premises. Thomas reached into his pocket and placed his badge and keys on the conference table. I'd like my termination in writing, specifying the reasons. That's not necessary, Donald began. I'd like it in writing, Thomas repeated firmly, for unemployment documentation. Jennifer sighed and typed rapidly on her laptop. I'll email it to you. I don't have email access as a custodial employee. I'll need it printed. Jennifer's expression showed irritation, but she clicked print. A few moments later, she handed Thomas a single page. Meridian Technologies. Termination notice. Employee, Thomas Harper. Position, custodial services. Hire date, January 15th, 2000. Termination. Date, October 31st, 2023. Reason, failure to maintain safety standards, policy violations, insufficient performance. This termination is effective immediately. Final pay including 2 weeks severance will be processed and available November 15th, 2023. Thomas folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. Thank you. He stood and walked toward the door. Harper, Marcus Webb called out, this is what happens when people coast, when they think showing up is enough. You've got maybe 5-10 years left to work. Use them to find something you're actually good at, because you weren't good at this. Thomas turned and looked at Marcus for a long moment. Thank you for the advice. He walked out of the conference room, through the HR department to the elevator. He took it to the basement facilities office where his small locker held a few personal items. A thermos, a photo of his late wife Margaret, a book of poetry she'd loved. He placed these items in a small cardboard box that had once held copy paper. Maria Santos found him there. Thomas, que pasó? What happened? They fired me, Thomas said simply. Que? But why? You've been here. 23 years. They needed to make an example for the restructuring. I was convenient. Maria's eyes filled with tears. This isn't right. You're the best worker here. You never complain, never... It's fine, Maria. Thomas patted her shoulder. Everything will be fine. But what will you do? You're 73? I'll manage. Take care of yourself. Take care of your family. Thomas carried his small box through the building's main lobby. It was 8:30 a.m. now, and employees were streaming in for the workday. No one looked at the elderly man carrying a box. Either they didn't recognize him, or they did, and looked away uncomfortably, not wanting to acknowledge witnessing someone's termination. He took the bus home, carrying his box, just another invisible worker discarded by a system that had no use for him. Except Thomas Harper wasn't discarded. He was repositioning. Tuesday, October 31st, 2023, 2 p.m. The Crown Room on Meridian Technologies' 42nd floor was arranged for an emergency board meeting. All 12 board members were present, along with CEO Richard Blackstone, COO Marcus Webb, CFO Patricia Chen, and General Counsel David Morrison. Richard Blackstone stood at the head of the table, looking satisfied. Before we begin the formal meeting, I want to address the situation from this morning. We terminated a custodial employee who'd become complacent and careless. I know this seems minor, but it's symbolically important. We're building a culture of accountability. and that means no one is exempt from standards, regardless of how long they've been here. Marcus Webb nodded. The employee in question had been coasting for years, made a safety error that could have injured staff. When confronted, he made excuses rather than taking responsibility, exactly the attitude we're trying to eliminate. Several board members nodded approvingly. This was the kind of tough leadership they'd been advocating: decisive action, clear consequences, no tolerance for mediocrity. Now, Richard continued, the primary purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the acquisition proposal we've received from Cascade Holdings. As you know, Cascade approached us 6 months ago about acquiring a significant stake. We've been negotiating terms, and they're ready to close. Patricia Chen displayed a presentation on the room's screen. Cascade Holdings is proposing to acquire 40% of Meridian's outstanding shares for $1.7 billion, which values Meridian at approximately $4.25 billion. This represents a 15% premium over current market value. The acquisition would provide us with capital for expansion, while allowing current leadership to retain operational control. What do we know about Cascade Holdings? One board member asked. It's a private investment entity registered in Delaware, David Morrison explained. Structure is common for high net worth individuals and family offices. They've been remarkably private about their beneficial owners, but our due diligence shows they have substantial assets, estimated at over $8 billion under management. Their investment thesis focuses on long-term value creation in technology companies. They're proposing board representation? Another member asked. Yes. 2 seats on our board as part of the deal. They've nominated an individual named Robert Castellano, a former tech CEO with extensive operational experience, and have indicated a second nominee to be named at closing. And they're comfortable with current management? They've specified that the deal is contingent on management remaining in place, Richard said, which means they believe in our strategy and leadership. This is a validation of everything we've built. The board discussed the proposal for 30 minutes, asking questions about terms, valuation, use of capital, strategic implications. The consensus was favorable. $1.7 billion in capital would fund expansion, the valuation was generous, and retaining operational control meant leadership could continue their strategy. A vote was called. The acquisition was approved unanimously. Excellent, Richard said. Cascade has indicated they want to close quickly. Their representative is arriving at 4 p.m. today for final signatures and to introduce themselves to the board. I'd like everyone to remain for that meeting. It's important we present a united front. The meeting adjourned for 2 hours. Board members left for lunch or to make calls. Executives returned to their offices to address pressing business. At 3:45 p.m., they reconvened in the Crown Room. The conference table had been reset with fresh water, coffee, and the closing documents for the acquisition. Hundreds of pages of contracts, representations, warranties, all reviewed by attorneys, all ready for signatures. At 4 p.m. exactly, Richard's assistant knocked and entered. Mr. Blackstone, Cascade Holdings representatives have arrived. Send them in. The door opened, and Thomas Harper walked in. He wasn't wearing his custodial uniform. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit perfectly, a white shirt, a silk tie, Italian leather shoes. His white hair was neatly trimmed. His posture was straight, no longer the hunched shuffle of an elderly janitor. Beside him walked a man in his 60s, tall, confident, in an equally expensive suit. This was Robert Castellano, the first nominated board member. The room went completely silent. Richard Blackstone's face went through several expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, horror. Marcus Webb looked like he'd seen a ghost. Board members stared, trying to reconcile the janitor they'd never noticed with the man standing before them in a $15,000 suit. "Good afternoon," Thomas said, his voice calm and clear. "I'm Thomas Harper, founder of Meridian Technologies and controlling shareholder through Cascade Holdings. This is Robert Castellano, my business partner and advisor. We're here to finalize the acquisition and discuss some concerning developments in how this company is being managed." Richard found his voice. "Thomas, but you were cleaning this morning. You were fired. I was fired by your COO for failing to clean a coffee spill that occurred 9 hours after my shift ended," Thomas said. That termination is one of many issues we'll be addressing. He walked to the head of the table, Richard's seat, and waited. Richard, after a frozen moment, moved to a side chair. Thomas sat down and opened a briefcase, removing documents and placing them on the table. Robert Castellano sat beside him, his expression neutral, but his presence adding weight to Thomas's authority. "Let me clarify the situation," Thomas said. "In 2001, when I stepped down as CEO, I publicly sold 49% of my shares, but retained 51% through Cascade Holdings. That ownership has been maintained through a trust structure that allowed me to observe this company's direction without the interference my presence as founder would have created. For 22 years, I watched from a distance. 2 years ago, I decided to observe more closely." He paused. "I applied for a custodial position under my own name, Thomas Harper, knowing that no one would recognize me or make the connection. I was hired without background checks that would have revealed my history because you don't perform thorough vetting for janitors. You just assumed I was an elderly man who needed work." Patricia Chen, the CFO, found her voice. "You worked as a janitor? To spy on us?" "I worked as a janitor to observe how this company treats people when leaders think no one important is watching," Thomas corrected. "I wanted to understand if the culture I'd tried to build had survived, if the values I'd established still mattered, if the people in leadership positions deserved the authority they held." "This is insane," Marcus Webb said. "You subjected yourself to being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as irrelevant." Thomas's voice remained calm. "Yes, and I learned a great deal. I learned that executives leave confidential documents in conference rooms because they assume janitors can't read. I learned that managers abuse custodial staff because they assume no one cares. I learned that this company makes decisions based on optics rather than ethics." He pulled out a document. "This morning, I was fired for a safety incident that occurred outside my scheduled work hours. The real reason was that Marcus Webb wanted to make an example of someone to demonstrate accountability during restructuring. He specifically chose a long-term employee to send a message that no one is safe." He looked at Marcus. "You told me I was dead weight who had been coasting for years. You suggested I find something I'm actually good at. I appreciate the advice. I've decided to get good at holding leaders accountable for abuse of power." Marcus's face was pale. "I didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. In 23 months of cleaning your office, you never once learned my name. You walked past me thousands of times without acknowledgement. And when you needed a scapegoat, you chose me because you thought I was powerless." Thomas pulled out more documents. "But let's talk about bigger issues. Over the past 2 years, I've documented systematic problems at Meridian Technologies." He distributed copies to board members. Page 3, falsified safety reports to avoid OSHA fines. The manufacturing division reported 0 safety incidents in 2022, but medical claims show 47 workplace injuries. The difference was achieved by pressuring employees not to report minor injuries and classifying serious injuries as non-work-related. Board members flipped to page 3, their expressions growing concerned. Page 7, discriminatory hiring practices. Analysis of hiring data shows systematic bias against candidates over 40 and racial minorities in technical positions. Despite claims of commitment to diversity, Meridian's workforce has become less diverse under current leadership. Page 12, retaliation against whistleblowers. 3 employees who reported concerns through the ethics hotline were subsequently fired for performance issues within 6 months. All 3 had positive reviews prior to their reports. Page 18, financial misrepresentation. Projections presented to investors included revenue from contracts that had been verbally discussed but not signed. When those contracts failed to materialize, the shortfall was blamed on market conditions rather than overly optimistic projections. Thomas continued methodically through the document, each page revealing another failure of ethics, leadership, or integrity. Board members read in silence, their expressions shifting from shock to concern to anger. "Where did you get this information?" David Morrison, the general counsel, asked. "I observed it while working here. I photographed documents left in conference rooms and trash bins. I listened to conversations that executives had in front of me because they assumed I was too stupid to understand. I watched how decisions were made when leaders thought no consequences existed. That's corporate espionage, Marcus said desperately. No, Robert Castellano spoke for the first time. It's a controlling shareholder conducting oversight of his own company. Thomas has every legal right to investigate how Meridian is being managed, and what he's found is deeply troubling. Thomas pulled out the termination notice he'd been given that morning. This document says I was fired for failure to maintain safety standards, policy violations, and insufficient performance. All of those reasons are false. I was fired because Marcus Webb needed to demonstrate toughness during restructuring, and an elderly janitor was a convenient target. That's not leadership. That's cruelty disguised as accountability. He looked at the board members. I've spent 2 years watching this company drift from its founding principles. You've prioritized short-term stock prices over long-term sustainability. You've treated employees as disposable. You've created a culture where appearance matters more than substance. And you've surrounded yourselves with leaders who abuse power because they think no one is watching. Richard Blackstone tried to salvage the situation. Thomas, I understand you're upset about the termination, but that was a misunderstanding. If you'd told us who you were. If I'd told you who I was, you would have treated me differently, Thomas interrupted. That's exactly the problem. Leadership character is revealed in how you treat people you think don't matter. For 23 months, I was someone you thought didn't matter, and you showed me exactly who you'd become. He paused. The acquisition by Cascade Holdings is proceeding, but the terms have changed. Instead of acquiring 40%, Cascade is exercising majority. Control through the 51% we already own. Robert will be joining as chairman of the board. I will be resuming operational involvement as executive chairman, and several changes will be made to leadership immediately. He looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus, you're terminated effective immediately for abuse of authority, retaliation against employees, and creating a hostile work environment. Security will escort you from the building. Marcus's face went red. You can't. I have a contract. Your contract includes a termination for cause provision. The documentation I've provided meets that standard. You'll receive no severance beyond what's legally required. Thomas looked at Donald Pierce from Facilities Management, who'd been called to observe the meeting. Donald, you're also terminated for complicity in wrongful termination and abuse of custodial staff. The pattern of complaints we've received from cleaning contractors about your conduct is unacceptable. He looked at Richard Blackstone. Richard, you're being moved from CEO to an advisory role, effective in 30 days. You'll assist with transition but will not be involved in day-to-day operations. Richard's jaw clenched. The board approved my leadership. This board failed in its oversight responsibilities, Thomas said. That's why we're reconstituting it. Of the current 12 members, 6 will be asked to resign for failure to provide adequate governance. They'll be replaced with individuals who take their fiduciary duties seriously. He pulled out a list of names. These are the board members being replaced. Each will receive formal notice by end of business today. The new board will include 3 independent directors with expertise in corporate ethics, employee relations, and operational excellence. One of the board members being replaced, Herbert Townsend, a wealthy investor who'd served for 8 years, stood angrily. This is a coup. You can't just waltz in here after 20 years and destroy what we've built. I'm not destroying what you've built, Thomas said calmly. I'm correcting what you've corrupted. Meridian Technologies was founded on principles of innovation, integrity, and treating people with dignity. Under your oversight, it became a place where profit mattered more than principle. That ends now. Robert Castellano spoke again. The legal authority for these actions is clear. Thomas holds majority control through Cascade Holdings. As controlling shareholder, he has the right to reconstitute the board and management. Every action being taken today is within his legal rights and has been reviewed by our counsel. He paused. What Thomas is offering is an opportunity to correct course before these issues become public. The alternative is that all of this documentation, the falsified safety reports, the discriminatory hiring, the whistleblower retaliation, the financial misrepresentation, becomes part of regulatory investigations and public lawsuits. I assure you the current path would be far more damaging to everyone involved. The room was silent. Board members who weren't being removed looked at each other, understanding that they'd failed. that the company they had been governing had drifted far from acceptable standards, and that correction was both necessary and inevitable. Thomas stood. The formal acquisition documents are ready for signature. Once complete, Cascade Holdings will control 51% of Meridian Technologies, with the remaining 49% staying publicly traded. The new organizational structure will be announced tomorrow morning. Terminated executives will be escorted from the building immediately. Board members who are being replaced will receive their formal notices within the hour. He paused. I didn't come back for revenge. I came back for accountability. The people in this room were given enormous responsibility to govern a $4 billion company employing 2,800 people. You failed that. Responsibility. You prioritized your comfort over others' dignity. You made decisions that enriched yourselves while harming those with no power to resist. He looked around the table. That failure ends today. Meridian Technologies will return to its founding principles. We'll treat employees with respect regardless of their position. We'll make decisions based on ethics, not just profit. We'll build a culture where character matters more than credentials. Thomas walked to the door, Robert following. Before leaving, Thomas turned back one final time. Marcus, you told me this morning to find something I'm good at. I've found it. I'm good at building companies that value people. I'm good at identifying when leaders have betrayed that trust. And I'm good at holding those leaders accountable. He left the boardroom, leaving behind executives whose careers had just collapsed and board members confronting their own failures of oversight. The janitor they'd fired that morning had returned as the owner they'd forgotten existed, and nothing would ever be the same. The next 90 days transformed Meridian Technologies completely. Marcus Webb was escorted from the building that afternoon by security, his office packed up in boxes, his company laptop and phone confiscated. He retained an attorney and threatened lawsuits, but when Thomas's legal team presented the documentation of his misconduct, abuse of staff, retaliatory terminations, falsified reports, the threats evaporated. Marcus settled for his legally required severance and a non-disparagement agreement that prevented him from speaking about his termination publicly. Donald Pierce, similarly, was terminated and escorted out. The custodial staff who had worked under him shared stories of verbal abuse, discriminatory treatment, and retaliatory scheduling that painted a picture of systemic cruelty. Thomas personally apologized to each member of the cleaning staff and increased their wages by 30%, implemented better scheduling, and ensured they had proper equipment and respect. Richard Blackstone served his 30-day transition period, then resigned officially. His departure was framed in press releases as retirement to pursue personal interests, which preserved his reputation enough to land a board seat at a smaller company. But within Meridian, everyone knew he'd been removed for failed leadership. 6 board members resigned under pressure, replaced by 3 independent directors with expertise in ethics, human resources, and operational excellence, plus 3 executives from other companies who brought fresh perspectives. Thomas resumed his role as executive chairman, working with Robert Castellano and a new CEO, Jennifer Park, formerly COO of a major tech company known for excellent culture and ethical operations. Jennifer was 48, experienced, and committed to rebuilding Meridian's culture from the ground up. The restructuring that had been planned, eliminating 400 positions, was canceled. Instead, Thomas initiated a comprehensive review of operations that identified actual inefficiencies and addressed them through process improvements rather than layoffs. The company actually hired 200 additional employees in customer service and quality control, positions that had been cut previously to improve margins, but that were essential for serving customers well. The falsified safety reports were corrected and submitted to OSHA, along with a full disclosure of past issues. Meridian paid significant fines, but avoided criminal charges because of their voluntary disclosure and corrective actions. The manufacturing division implemented comprehensive safety improvements, hired additional safety officers, and created a culture where reporting injuries was encouraged rather than punished. The discriminatory hiring practices were addressed through revised procedures, implicit bias training for all hiring managers, and oversight from the new HR VP, an expert in diversity and inclusion who implemented blind resume screening and structured interviews to reduce bias. The whistleblower retaliation victims were contacted, offered severance increases and apologies, and in 2 cases, invited to return to the company in better positions. All 3 accepted. The financial misrepresentation issues were disclosed to investors through corrected filings, resulting in a temporary stock price decline, but establishing transparency that eventually rebuilt investor confidence. Throughout all of this, Thomas remained remarkably composed and focused on correction rather than punishment. He didn't publicly humiliate the executives he'd removed. He didn't release the documentation that would have destroyed their careers permanently. He simply corrected the problems, implemented better systems, and moved forward. Maria Santos, the custodial worker who'd been Thomas's friend during his time as a janitor, was promoted to facilities operations manager, replacing Donald Pierce. She implemented better working conditions for all custodial staff, hired more workers to reduce workload, and created a culture of respect and dignity. 3 months after his return, Thomas stood in the Crown Room, the same room where he'd been fired, the same room where he'd revealed his identity, addressing Meridian's leadership team. "I spent 23 months as a janitor in this company," Thomas said. "I pushed a mop, emptied trash, cleaned bathrooms, and maintained spaces that executives used without acknowledgement. I became invisible, and from that position of invisibility, I saw the truth about how this company operates." He paused. "What I saw was disappointing, but it was also correctable. Companies don't fail because of bad strategy or market conditions. They fail because of bad culture, because leaders prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability, because people in power forget that their authority is a responsibility, not a privilege. The changes we've made over the past 90 days aren't about punishment, they're about correction. We removed leaders who abused power, but we also created systems to prevent future abuse. We addressed specific problems, but we also built processes to identify problems earlier. We corrected past wrongs, but we also established a culture where future wrongs are less likely." He looked around the room at the new leadership team, some promoted from within, some hired from outside, all selected for character as much as competence. Going forward, Meridian Technologies will be known for 2 things: innovation and integrity. We'll continue pushing technological boundaries because that's our competitive advantage, but we'll do it ethically, treating employees with dignity, serving customers with honesty, and governing ourselves with transparency. The janitor experiment is over, but the lessons from it will guide us for decades. Never forget that how you treat people who can't benefit you reveals your character. Never forget that power without accountability breeds corruption. And never forget that the person you dismiss as irrelevant might be the person who determines your future. The meeting ended. Thomas returned to his office. Not the CEO's office, but a smaller space he'd chosen, one with windows overlooking the city, but without the ostentatious trappings of executive excess. He'd accomplished what he'd set out to do. He'd tested whether Meridian Technologies had retained its values, found it had not, and corrected course. The company was profitable, growing, and now operated with principles that aligned with his vision. That evening, Thomas sat in his modest apartment, the same apartment he'd lived in during his time as a janitor. Despite his billions in wealth, he'd never needed expensive homes or luxury possessions. His late wife, Margaret, had taught him that fulfillment came from impact, not accumulation. On his desk sat the framed photo of Margaret that he'd carried in his small box the morning of his termination. Beside it sat his custodial badge, Thomas, custodial. He'd kept the badge as a reminder that dignity isn't determined by title, that worth isn't measured by position. That character is revealed in how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter. Marcus Webb had told him to find something he was good at. Thomas had found it. He was good at building companies that valued people over profit, principles over politics, integrity over image. And he was good at holding leaders accountable when they forgot those values. The quiet janitor had become the returning founder, and Meridian Technologies was better for it. The moral of the story: he pushed a mop through executive offices for 23 months, while managers walked past him discussing million-dollar deals, never lowering their voices because they assumed he couldn't understand. They left sensitive documents on conference tables because a janitor couldn't possibly read or matter. They mocked his silence, his age, his invisibility. And when they needed someone to fire during restructuring, someone to make an example of, someone to prove they were serious about accountability, they chose him. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he was convenient, powerless, disposable. The COO told him he'd been coasting for years, that he was dead weight, that he should find something he's actually good at. They fired him in front of witnesses to send a message, gave him a box for his belongings and 2 weeks severance they weren't required to provide, watched him leave carrying everything he owned from that building in a cardboard box. Hours later, they sat in the same boardroom celebrating the arrival of their new majority owner, the investor who'd just acquired controlling stake in their $4.2 billion company. The doors opened, and the janitor walked back in. Not in a gray uniform, but in a $15,000 suit. Not hunched and shuffling, but straight and commanding. Because Thomas Harper wasn't a janitor. He was the founder who'd started Meridian Technologies 42 years ago, who'd built it from a garage to a billion-dollar public company, who'd stepped down as CEO in 2001, but secretly retained 51% ownership through a trust structure nobody knew about. For 22 years, he'd watched from a distance. Then 2 years ago, he'd applied for a custodial position in his own company under his real name, knowing no one would recognize him or connect the dots. He was hired without anyone asking questions because companies don't thoroughly vet janitors. They just assume elderly people cleaning offices are exactly what they appear to be. And for 23 months, Thomas Harper had observed how the company he'd built treated people when leaders thought no one important was watching. What he saw destroyed him. Executives abusing staff, leaders, falsifying safety reports, managers retaliating against whistleblowers, a culture that valued profit over people, appearance over ethics, credentials over character. He documented everything. Photographed documents left carelessly in conference rooms. Recorded conversations executives had in front of him because they assumed he was too old or too stupid to understand. Built a comprehensive case of systematic failure. Then he let them fire him. Let the COO call him dead weight. Let them terminate him for a coffee spill that happened 9 hours after his shift ended. Let them think they'd successfully made an example of a powerless old man. Because that termination was the final piece of evidence he needed, proof that leadership had become so arrogant, so divorced from basic decency, that they'd abused someone they thought couldn't fight back. When he walked back into that boardroom, hours after his termination, when he sat at the head of the table and revealed that the janitor they had fired that morning was the controlling shareholder who'd founded the company, the room froze. The COO who'd called him dead weight turned white. The executives who'd ignored him for 23 months couldn't meet his eyes. The board members who'd failed in their oversight duties realized they'd been tested and failed spectacularly. Thomas didn't raise his voice, didn't seek humiliation or revenge, just calmly removed the COO for abuse of authority, terminated the facilities manager for misconduct, moved the CEO to an advisory role, reconstituted half the board, and presented documentation of every failure, every ethical lapse, every moment when leaders had chosen convenience over character. The executives who'd treated him as nothing suddenly faced losing everything, their jobs, their reputations, their authority, all because they'd been so arrogant they'd abused someone without bothering to ask who he was. The lesson wasn't subtle. Character is revealed in how you treat people who can't benefit you. Leadership is tested in how you wield power over those who have none. And assumptions about people based on their position or appearance can destroy everything you've built. Thomas didn't come back to humiliate them. He came back to rebuild the company they'd corrupted, to restore values they'd abandoned, to hold leaders accountable for forgetting that authority is responsibility, not privilege. The janitor they'd dismissed as too old, too quiet, too irrelevant to matter, had been the most powerful person in the building all along, watching, documenting, waiting for the right moment to return. And when he did, he didn't just fire the people who'd abused him. He dismantled the entire culture that had allowed that abuse to flourish. Some people learn that underestimating the quiet ones costs them their jobs. Marcus Webb learned it cost him his career. Others learned that cruelty has consequences. Donald Pierce learned that abusing people without power works until you discover they had all the power. And the board learned that failing oversight duties isn't consequence-free when the person you've failed to protect turns out to be the person who can remove you from your position. The most expensive coffee spill in corporate history wasn't the one that got Thomas fired. It was the culture of carelessness and arrogance that made executives think they could fire a janitor without consequences. Because that janitor owned 51% of the company, and he'd been watching them fail for 23 months, building a case, waiting for the moment when their arrogance would peak. That moment was his termination, and his return destroyed everything they'd built on foundations of cruelty and corruption. If this story resonates, if you've been dismissed as irrelevant, treated as invisible, underestimated because of your position or appearance, hit that like button. Share with anyone who needs to hear that power doesn't always announce itself, that silence isn't weakness, and that the person you're dismissing might be the person who determines your future. Subscribe for stories about underestimation's consequences, arrogance punished, and the moment when those who felt untouchable learned they'd just abused the one person who could destroy them. Remember, never judge people by their position. Never assume the quiet ones lack power. And never ever treat someone as disposable without knowing who they really are. Because the janitor you fire today might be the owner who fires you tomorrow. And by then, it's far too late to apologize.